Hello and welcome to the End Times Revival Ministries. Thank you so much for joining us for another installment on the glory of God. I want to pick up from a passage in the book of Exodus in chapter 20. It's probably one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible because it contains the 10 commandments given to Moses by God. And hear what God says as the very first commandment given to Moses, which would be relayed to or conveyed to the people. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, I am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Now you ask yourself, what does this has to do with the glory of God? But notice here, there is a self-revelation of God. The very first thing that God does, it is to proclaim His holiness and His glory to Moses. That becomes the foundation of everything else. That you must first understand who He is and His essence before you begin to follow through with the rest of His commandments. And I don't want to go into the other commandments. I want us to look at that particular verse 3 and 4, which talks about you shall have no other God besides me. And then we will look at how that relates to the glory of God. So God, firstly, what He does, He comes with a negative. In other words, He forbids the nation to make any other carved image or anything in the likeness of God. He discourages them from that. It's more than a discouragement, it's a command, an order for them not to make anything that looks like God, because then they would end up bowing to it and worshiping it and attributing the essence of God to such an image. Now that particular commandment, a lot of believers will claim that it's in the Old Testament and we are not bound by the 10 commandments, and therefore we need to look for a much more merciful God in the New Testament. But notice what God says here: you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven or on earth. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. That jealousy of God stays. That is a permanent state. It's part of God's essence that He is a jealous God. He says that out of His jealousy, He visits the iniquity of the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation. Now again, we hear arguments that such a brutality, why would God visit the sins of the fathers on their children and on their grandchildren? How brutal, how unfair, how unjust that would be. But then listen to the second phrase, what God says. But I don't just visit the iniquity of the fathers on their children and their grandchildren, but I also show mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. And when we talk about the God of wrath and God who is so brutal in the Old Testament, notice in that particular verse, when He is talking about His essence, He speaks about mercy. There is mercy in the Old Testament. In the middle of the very first commandment, God says, I am merciful to thousands who love me and who keep my commandments. Now, what this is teaching here is that it is a combination of the essence of God, that He is a God who will not let sin go unpunished, because as we've seen before, then He would not be a holy God. And if He is not holy, He would not be God in the first place, and He would be not worthy of a worship. He cannot make a claim of being distinct or different from His creation. But in this particular case, He says, I am transcendent, I am holy, I go after sin up to the third and the fourth generation, but I also give mercy. The God that we have to do is a holy God, a God of justice, a God who will not let sin go unpunished, and yet a God of mercy at the same time. We've got to see that in the Old and the New Testament, these two essence of God, they hold together, His holiness and His mercy. they are clearly brought together in this particular commandment. You shall have no other God besides me. Not because of any other reason, but for the very reason that those likeness, in the moment that you diminish me to an image or a likeness or a semblance that looks like me and it's not me, you do away with God. You have no God to worship the moment that you create images that look like God. You see, when the whole creation proclaimed God as glorious, they do so in response to the self-revelation of God. They have no Bible, they have no commandments, they don't even have a promise of eternal destruction. And yet, out of self-revelation of God, they worship Him as a holy God. The call is for every single human being to realize that God has revealed Himself. And here He tells us, I am holy. I will not let sin go unpunished, but I'm also a merciful God. That is God in His glory.